Salaway, and welcome back to the Everything History podcast. This is episode 37, The Battle of Actium. With all other obstacles and opponents out of the way for both Octavian and Antony, the two began to turn against each other. This episode will cover approximately 5 years in time, and in that time, not only does the second triumvirate deteriorate, but it actually expires. Octavian Caesar hits his political stride, and of course, the romance of Antony and Cleopatra is in full swing.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Before I dig deep into this, let's start off with Marcus Lepidus. Lepidus is of course the third member of the second triumvirate, and he has just helped Octavian and Agrippa finish off Sextus Pompey in 36 BCE with the takeover of Sicily. Lepidus had attacked Sicily from Africa to the south, and he was the commander that retook the greatest portion of Sicily as Agrippa defeated Pompeius on the sea. Why do I tell you this? Well, as it happened, Lepidus' success gave him some newfound political tenacity. A little too late, I would say, but Lepidus decided to try and use his legions to secure Sicily for himself. You see, Lepidus was discontented that he had been relegated to the province of Africa and wanted to also have control of Sicily and the surrounding islands. But this little insurrection did not last long because Lepidus' legions refused to fight against Octavian, so the whole thing sputtered out. Once Octavian discovered this, he stripped Lepidus of the office of triumvir and took the province of Africa into his own control. He did let Lepidus live, though, and retain the title of Pontifex Maximus, meaning the chief priest of the Roman religion. That is the last I will mention of Lepidus, for he lived a few more decades in silent peace on his Italian villa. Also, I must again address the office of triumvir because its legal specifics are quite important in this history now. You will recall from 2 episodes previous that when the Second Triumvirate was formed, it was formed legally through a ratification by the People's Assemblies in 42 BCE. The law stated that each triumvir would hold the office for 2 terms, each being 5 years in length. I bring this up because this episode has begun in the year 36 BCE, and the 2 lasting triumvirs were already in their second term of office, and they would lose its extraordinary powers in late 32 BCE. Now, why does this matter? Couldn't Antony and Octavian simply stay in power because they had command of the armies? Yes, they certainly could, but if they did, that would be illegal. Legality has not stopped Roman leaders before, but Octavian Caesar was different. He will use legality and tradition to his own advantage. With Sextus Pompey dead and Lepidus officially relegated, the late Roman Republic was led by Octavian Caesar and Mark Antony, west and east, respectively. Would the 2 rule in peace until their time in public office was over? No, of course not. The 2 men really did not like each other, probably because they were polar opposites personality-wise. Just look at their patron deities. Octavian's was Apollo, while Antony's was Dionysus. More than personality and a natural sense of hatred between them, they did not want to share power. The big difference, however, between Caesar and Antony when it came to power, though, was planning. Octavian had a very clear plan for how he wanted to rule and conduct affairs in Rome. Antony did not. He was much more of a spontaneous decision-maker. Regardless, the point is, after the defeat of Sextus Pompey, the 2 triumvirs were on a collision course. Only one could remain, Caesar or Antony. And this was a realization that became clear as soon as 36 BCE, when, as I detailed at the conclusion of last episode, Octavian only gave Antony 1/10 of the legionnaires that had been agreed upon. Octavian had taken 130 ships from Antony to fight Pompey with the expectation that he would give Antony 20,000 legionnaires. After his victory, Octavian did not, and that is the verifiable moment that Octavian and Antony became enemies once more. Thereafter, Caesar began to structure all of his long-term policies and moves with the expectation of fighting Antony in the future, both politically and militarily. Still though, any conflict was 5 years away at best because Octavian needed a motive to attack, and that would not be available until their terms as triumvirs were at an end. That being the case, Octavian moved back to Rome and along the way discharged thousands of his legionnaires. Many of them were discontented with their gifts, but Octavian refused to give in to their greed. The armies remained loyal, but their future loyalties were somewhat uncertain. Nevertheless, the younger Caesar's return to Rome was a tremendous affair. The Senate bestowed upon him the greatest of honors, many of which Octavian actually refused. He did not want to be glorified as his adopted father had, but he gladly encouraged the people to pray and give thanks at the altar of his divine father Julius Caesar. Octavian denied two prominent honors, that of a triumph and that of the high priesthood title of Pontifex Maximus. Caesar announced publicly that he refused the triumph because he did not want to celebrate a civil war, and he had refused the title of Pontifex Maximus because Lepidus, though a traitor, had been given the title, a title that was always held for life. Therefore, in keeping with tradition, he refused to accept the honor. The younger Caesar then set about restructuring his territories. He relieved Italian farmers of their taxes so they might see relief. He sent runaway slaves back to their masters, and came down hard on burglars, vagabonds, and other ruffians who had been skirting the law during the civil wars. Caesar also sold off the last of the prescription's property, and for the first time in a decade, the treasuries of Rome began to be filled. And he also began to institute security throughout his provinces. Security of law and order that Octavian enforced with bolstered guards and watches throughout. Caesar also allowed normalcy to return by allowing the assemblies, the Senate, and the various magistrates to govern once more unobstructed. It truly seemed as if Caesar had restored the Republic, and this thought was reinforced when Octavian stated that he was in the process now of fully restoring the Roman constitution. He also publicly announced that he hoped his colleague Antony would do the same. Meanwhile, as Caesar proceeded to slowly restore Rome, Antony moved east. He sent legions and his greatest commanders to Mesopotamia to meet any invading Parthian forces. These legions also began preparations for an extended campaign into Parthian territory. Antony arrived in Greece with his wife Octavia, and they wintered in Athens. There Octavia gave birth to another daughter by Antony. They were both named Antonia, the major and minor, elder and younger. And this would be the last child of their relationship. News then came to them in Athens that the Roman legions led by General Ventidius had decisively crushed the Parthians on 3 separate occasions. This earned Ventidius a triumph and Antony even more fame in the east, although not amongst the soldiers because Antony had not been leading them. After traveling back and forth and meeting with Octavian back in Italia, where they made their agreement of ships for legions, Antony left Octavia with her brother and returned east to mop up any problems in the provinces of Asia, Syria, and Judea that were left over. As Antony dealt with a fair amount of Jewish troubles near Syria, it seems that Mark Antony's brutish thoughts of Cleopatra returned to him. Plutarch writes, quote, "The dire evil in which had been slumbering for a long time, namely, his passion for Cleopatra, which men thought had been lulled away by time and Octavia, blazed up again with renewed power. And finally, like the stubborn and unmanageable beast of the soul that Plato spoke of, he refused all counsel and advice by bringing Cleopatra to meet him in Syria." End quote. Antony then resumed his affair with Cleopatra and actually gave her authority over several territories, Roman territories, including Phoenicia, part of Syria, Cyprus, part of Cilicia, and part of Judea. When this news reached Rome, the people were displeased and perplexed by the actions of Antony. They wondered why he was doing this. Antony only continued to displease, however, by conducting even more strange actions. He publicly acknowledged his children by Cleopatra, which was highly unusual and a break from Roman tradition, and he began preparations to attack Parthia once more. This military action confused his advisors and the people because there was no need for another attack given Ventidius' successes. Antony was in desire for conquest, however, and ignored his advisors. He also ignored the fact that it was already late summer, early autumn in the year 36 BCE, meaning that winter was coming soon, and while it may not impact the lands near Syria, it would punish Central Asia, which is where Antony wanted to launch his campaign. Given the short amount of time, Antony became even more impatient. He force-marched his army across modern-day Turkey into the allied kingdom of Armenia, and because Antony wanted to finish the campaign early, he immediately pushed onwards into Parthian territory. The ancient sources tell us that Antony wanted to finish the war so quickly because he yearned to winter back in Alexandria with Cleopatra. But, as you might expect, the gods of war do not care much for the schedules and wants of men. Thus, because Antony was in so much of a hurry, he left his army exposed and suffered a series of defeats near modern-day Azerbaijan. These losses frightened the Armenian leaders and soldiers, and they abandoned the Romans and escaped back to Armenia. Antony then ordered his army to retreat, and winter began to descend rapidly on his legions. His crippled Roman army was also harassed by Parthian attacks until they returned to the safety of Roman territory. The entire Parthian campaign was a disaster, and Antony lost at least 1/4 of his army. Most of the casualties, however, came due to disease and winter weather extremities. In other words, the army had suffered because of Mark Antony's hasty decision-making. In late 35 BCE, though, Antony relaunched his army, this time to punish the Armenians who had abandoned the Roman legions. This was a successful enterprise, and Antony ceased military operations against Parthia thereafter. And upon his return to Alexandria, he portrayed everything as a success and even conducted a mock Roman triumph in honor of his quote-unquote victories. And when I say mock, I do not mean that Antony made a joke of it, I mean he tried to replicate the original. Oh, and if you would like to read a quite detailed history of Antony's Parthian campaigns, I recommend Plutarch's Life of Antony, chapters 35 to about 65 or thereabouts. Now you should know that all of Antony's deeds and actions that I have just detailed greatly disturbed the Roman people and gave Octavian a lot of material to tear Antony down politically. The people were disturbed because Antony was behaving erratically and non-Roman. Senators and advisors were perplexed at his poor military decision-making because he was usually such a sound soldier. The people also disagreed with Antony's insistence on war with Parthia because the conflict seemed unnecessary, and the patricians and equestrian classes knew that Antony only sought out such wars for personal glory. A Republican man was not supposed to be a warmonger, and certainly not supposed to be busying himself in the far-off deserts of the East without the permission of the Roman Senate. As a last bit for now, the Roman populace disapproved of Antony's mock triumph in Alexandria because the triumph was a sacred celebration to Rome. They were only granted by the Senate and the people of the city of Rome, and the celebrations were deeply intertwined with Roman paganism and tradition. To falsify such a proud tradition in Egypt was a blatant breach of their ancestors' tradition, and Romans took their traditions very seriously. The year then shifted to 34 BCE, and Octavian, with the approval of his advisors, chiefly Maecenas, sent Octavia to Antony. This was a public political act by Caesar to provoke Antony and Cleopatra into a political trap, because Caesar and Maecenas suspected that Cleopatra would not allow Antony to meet with his wife. And if she did, then Caesar could prove to the people that Antony was ignoring his Roman wife, his Roman family, and listening to the Eastern queen Cleopatra. And predictably, Cleopatra fell into Caesar's ploy. In her jealousy of Octavia and distrust of Caesar, Cleopatra began to openly manipulate Antony. She is cited as starving herself to look more appealing, weeping when Antony mentioned leaving her to go elsewhere, and she even threatened to kill herself if she was separated from Antony. In other words, Cleopatra was intentionally being a crazy, jealous psycho. These type of people still exist in relationships. Some of you listeners may have personal experience. The difference is that Cleopatra was intentionally doing this. But I guess that's also what crazy partners do in relationships. Regardless, Cleopatra's manipulation worked like the charm that it was. Antony sent word to Octavia telling her to stop and stay in Athens, making excuses for why. But everyone in the Republic knew why. Cleopatra. Over the course of 34 BCE, the tense political situation between Caesar and Antony was only exacerbated further. Caesar continued to quietly construct his political narrative against Antony and Cleopatra continued to push Antony further and further away from Caesar and any prospect of peace. In fact, Antony would never even see his wife Octavia or his children by her or his previous wife Fulvia ever again, which is quite sad, I might say. And how Antony and Cleopatra presented themselves changed rapidly as well. They and their children were being treated as godlike royalty, which was a common role for leaders in Egypt and the Near East, but something despised by the Romans. This was made worse still when Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and paraded his non-Roman family about in the garb of Near Easterners. He himself was dressed like a Greek, Cleopatra portrayed herself as the Egyptian goddess Isis, and their children dressed in the manner of Hellenistic kings. That is about as non-Roman as it gets, and it is worse still when you consider that Antony was doing all of this in Egypt, a land that was subservient to the Roman Republic, but not even part of the Republic. By the year 33 BCE, the alliance between Antony and Caesar was officially at an end. They no longer corresponded, and they both knew that war was inevitable. Thus, with the affairs of the past 3 years, 36 to 33 BCE, the people had began to turn against Mark Antony. The affairs that had tarnished his reputation in Rome were somewhat orchestrated by Octavian, but more often they occurred by chance because of constant interference by Cleopatra. Moving onwards, on January 1st, 33 BCE, Octavian addressed the Senate immediately as they reconvened, and he delivered a speech railing against Antony. He denounced Antony, stating that he had become corrupted by the vices of luxury, drunkenness, and lust. Caesar declared that Antony was no longer even Roman, for he refused to even see his Roman family, and behaved like a king in a far-off land in the bed of a foreign queen. And as you might know, Romans have a very bad history when it comes to kings. On a last note, Caesar reported much to his own distress that his former colleague was behaving in this manner because he had become bewitched by Cleopatra. In truth, Caesar said, it was Cleopatra that was ruling Antony and ruling the East, and Rome could not suffer to let this stand, and therefore, as elected consul for the year 33 BCE, Caesar recommended the Senate strip Mark Antony of his powers. And as a gesture of good faith, Octavian resigned the office of consul after his January 1st speech. Thus, in a display of exceptional political skill, Octavian let the Senate decide Antony's vote. And I might note that though Caesar had resigned the consulship, he was still very much in control, for he continued to hold the office of triumvir. The Roman Senate went into a great debate, but Caesar already knew very well the decision they would make. The Senate voted to strip Antony of the consulship, but refused to go any further, and though Octavian had desired more, he was more than happy with the decision. However, Mark Antony still had many friends in the Senate and all over Italia. After Caesar's deliberate provocation, many of these wealthy and powerful friends feared the wrath of Octavian for publicly opposing him, and many Antonian supporters began to escape to the east lest another purge occur. But Caesar was lenient. He let them go freely and even offered passage to those that wished. This kindness was political, but it was kindness nonetheless. Yet when Antony heard of all this, he began to make his legions ready once more, and when his supporters arrived, Antony set about creating an identical Roman Senate in the east. These new supporters and advisors all told Antony to send Cleopatra away, for she would be unfit for war and detrimental to him politically. What they didn't add was that they also wanted her away because they felt Cleopatra was poisoning his mind. And therefore you can tell that not everything Caesar was stating was propaganda. Much of it was true, and all of it had a kernel of truth to it, like all good propaganda does. And surprisingly, Antony agreed to send her away, but Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra bribed her way back into Antony's presence, and Antony did not have the strength to send her away again. The two of them then moved into Greece and the city of Athens. Octavia wanted to meet with her husband to put sense back into his head, but Cleopatra convinced Antony to send her away. Thus Octavia fled with the children back to her brother in Rome. Antony set up court in Athens and began to muster forces as the calendar shifted to 32 BCE. But Mark Antony's behavior only deteriorated. He began to behave even more erratically, and even his close advisors and friends noted that he appeared intoxicated more frequent than not, and rarely made decisions without Cleopatra's presence. This so disgusted many of them that some of Antony's closest confidants defected to Caesar in Rome. And Plutarch says, quote, "When Caesar heard of the rapidity and extent of Antony's preparations, he was much disturbed, lest he should be forced to settle the issue of the war during that summer." End quote. And the summer Plutarch referenced was that of 32 BCE. Moreover, Caesar accepted the defection of two of Antony's closest and most noteworthy advisors, Marcus Titius and Lucius Plancus. The two of them gave Octavian key information about Cleopatra and the infamous will of Mark Antony. They relayed stories about Cleopatra's control over Antony and his drunkenness. These were good for propaganda purposes, but the information they had about Antony's will was a real political bombshell, and they assured Caesar that the details held therein would secure support for Octavian. The problem, though, was that the will was held in the ancient temple of the Vestal Virgins, the most sacred temple in the Roman world that had been around since the city's foundation during the age of the Roman kings. As I'm sure you can guess, it is illegal to seize a person's legal documents, especially their will, before their death. And it's highly illegal for a man to enter the temple of the Vestal Virgins. Octavian Caesar ignored such rules and seized Mark Antony's will by himself. The young Caesar then, upon reading the will, read the will of Antony to the Roman Senate aloud. This was very illegal and highly unusual, but Octavian stated that he had probable cause, and he also knew that no one could oppose him. He also knew that the contents of the will would destroy Mark Antony's political career. Antony's will stated that upon his death he was to be taken to Alexandria and buried alongside Cleopatra, and that if he should die before Cleopatra, that she was to inherit all of his domains and their children were to rule selected lands, and not only that, but the will also publicly recognized Caesarion, the supposed son of Julius Caesar, as the king of kings. The Senate went into a frenzy. The supporters of Antony still left, assailed Caesar for violating the temple of the Vestal Virgins, but the supporters of Caesar declared that despite such unfortunate events, the will proved that Antony had abandoned Rome, his family, and the Republic by falling prey to Cleopatra and trying to form a royal dynasty of Eastern kings. This, they declared, was sufficient reason to move on the now non-Roman Mark Antony. And as the Senate quarreled, Caesar and Agrippa began mustering their legions and naval forces for one more all-out civil war, West versus East. The Senate finally came to a decision. They stripped Antony of all titles and authority and declared war. But Caesar did not have them declare war on Antony. No, he had the Republic declare war on Cleopatra instead. Caesar did this to convince his soldiers that this was a war against a foreign power, not a civil war. Thus Octavian could say that he was fighting to save the Roman East from the rule of the evil Cleopatra. And he was not fighting Mark Antony, he was fighting Cleopatra's slave that used to be the honorable Mark Antony. Still, despite Caesar's popularity with the army, the war was a very hard pill to swallow for everyone, East or West. And some ancient sources attest that 1/3 of the Senate fled to the court of Antony in Athens. Nevertheless, Caesar had played the political battle wondrously, and all of the major actions had been entirely legal and sanctioned by the Roman Senate themselves. Octavian also secured his election as a consul for the next year, and publicly resigned his position as triumvir. So the young Caesar had done a damn fine job at covering all of his bases politically, but now came the business of war. Caesar and Agrippa were disadvantaged militarily, for they had approximately 80,000 legionnaires, 12,000 cavalry, and only 250 to 300 warships, while Antony and Cleopatra had just shy of 100,000 legionnaires, the same number of cavalry, and almost 500 warships. Much of Antony's navy, however, was Egyptian, and all of his vessels were massive behemoths, while Caesar's vessels were smaller and more nimble. Caesar and Agrippa also had the advantage of experience on the sea, for they had just finished honing their skills in naval warfare against Sextus Pompey. For this reason, the advisors of Antony at his war council strongly suggested a battle on land, but Cleopatra once more interfered and convinced Antony to settle the war by sea. Her logic was that they had the advantage of numbers more clearly by sea, but Cleopatra was not much of a military tactician, and she did not understand how sea battles took place or how they were commanded. Nevertheless, Antony and Cleopatra moved their massive army across Greece to the Gulf of Actium, expecting an open sea battle in the Ionian Sea between Italia and Greece. But Caesar and Agrippa had moved preemptively and had already arrived in northern Epirus and were on their way down to meet Antony. Thus it seemed that the war between Caesar and Antony was going to begin with a triumphant and deadly bang between two massive armies. But in fact, the war was to begin and end in a fizzle rather than a bang. When they arrived, Caesar and Agrippa arrayed their forces on the northern side of the Gulf of Actium, while Antony took the south side. Agrippa then took the navy of Caesar and blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's naval fleet. The soldiers and eastern kings then pleaded Mark Antony to forget the sea, and one battle-scarred soldier even said to Antony, quote, "Imperator, why dost thou distrust thine wounds and this sword, and put thy hopes in miserable logs of wood?" Let Egyptians and Phoenicians do their fighting at sea, but give us Romans land, on which we are accustomed to stand and either conquer or die." End quote. But Antony was determined to have it be settled on sea. It was then that Caesar let it be known that if any forces should come to his side, he would forget their sins and greet them as friends. And, astonishingly, many of Antony's men did, including 2 eastern kings, Amyntas and Diatorus, who took all of their men with them as well. And Caesar did truly treat them as friends. Finally, after 5 days of tension and bad weather, the Battle of Actium was pitched on September 2nd, 31 BCE, and I will let Plutarch describe the battle for you. In the 6th hour, the soldiers of Antony became impatient at the delay, and relying on the height and size of their ships as making them unassailable, they put their left wing in motion. When Caesar saw this, he was delighted, and ordered his right wing to row backwards, wishing to draw the enemy still farther out from the Gulf and the Narrows, and then to surround them with his own agile vessels and come to close quarters with ships which, owing to their great size and the smallness of their crews, were slow and ineffective. Though the struggle was beginning to be at close range, the ships did not ram or crush one another at all. The struggle was therefore like a land battle, or, to speak more truly, like the storming of a walled tower. For 3 or 4 of Caesar's vessels were engaged at a time about one of Antony's, and the crews fought with wicker shields and spears and punting poles and fiery missiles. The soldiers of Antony also shot with catapults from wooden towers. And now, as Agrippa was extending the left wing with a view to encircling the enemy, Publicola of Antony was forced to advance against him, and so part of Antony's fleet was separated from the center. The center then fell into confusion, although the sea battle was still undecided and equally favorable to both sides. But suddenly, 60 ships of Cleopatra were seen hoisting their sails for flight and making off through the midst of the combatants, for they had been posted in the rear of the large vessels, and threw them into confusion as they plunged through. The enemy looked on with amazement, seeing that they took advantage of the wind and made for the Peloponnese. Here indeed Antony made it clear to all the world that he was swayed neither by the sentiments of a commander nor of a brave man, but as someone in pleasantry said, that the soul of the lover dwells in another's body. He was dragged along by the woman Cleopatra as if he had become incorporate with her and must go where she did. For no sooner did he see her ship sailing off than he forgot everything else, betrayed and ran away from those who were fighting and dying in his cause, got into a 5-oared galley, and hastened after the woman Cleopatra, who had already ruined him and would make his ruin still more complete. Cleopatra recognized him and raised a signal on her ship, but he neither saw nor was seen by her. Instead he went forward alone to the prow and sat down by himself in silence, holding his head in both hands. Fleeing as such, this was the situation of Antony, but at Actium his fleet held out for a long time against Caesar, and only after it had been most severely damaged by the high sea which rose against it did it reluctantly, at the 10th hour, give up the struggle. There were not more than 5,000 dead, but 300 ships were captured as Caesar himself had written. Only a few were aware that Antony had fled, and to those who heard of it the story was at first an incredible one, that he had gone off and left 19 legions of undefeated men-at-arms and 12,000 horsemen, as if he had not many times experienced both kinds of fortune and were not exercised by the reverse of countless wars and fightings. End quote. Thus there you have it. Caesar won the Battle of Actium with smaller and more agile vessels after Cleopatra abandoned the battle and fled with her fleet, causing Antony to flee with her. At last, Octavian Caesar was the sole ruler of Rome, and next episode he will fully rid himself of Mark Antony and begin his transformation into Augustus. If you have any questions, corrections, or concerns, please contact me at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com or find the podcast Facebook page.
Thank you very much.